It's not every day you see a billionaire, a former president, and a man known for his larger-than-life personality standing in the middle of a downtown street, speaking softly to a homeless veteran, offering a hand to lift him off the ground. How did Donald Trump, a man whose name is synonymous with power, wealth, and controversy, find himself in this moment of uncharacteristic humility? What led to this act of kindness? And why did it capture the world's attention? The streets of New York City are always alive with energy, a buzz that never seems to quiet. But on this chilly autumn morning, amidst the usual hustle, something felt different. The towering skyscrapers cast their long shadows, and the hum of traffic filled the air, but there, on a small corner of Fifth Avenue, a crowd had gathered. Not for a parade or a protest, but for something more unexpected, a chance encounter between Donald Trump and a homeless man named Jack Turner, a veteran who had fallen through the cracks of society's safety net. The story of Jack's fall from grace was a familiar one. A young man full of promise, serving his country with honor, only to return home broken by the scars of war. With each passing year, Jack's struggles mounted. His pride kept him from asking for help, but his survival instincts led him to the streets, where he spent his days hiding from the world. The man who had once stood tall now shrank in the shadows of city buildings. Trump, on the other hand, was a man of many faces. Some saw him as a businessman, others as a controversial figure in politics. But today he was simply a man walking through his city. His routine was interrupted when he spotted Jack, his worn jacket and dusty face the silent testimony to years of hardship. Trump had passed by plenty of homeless people before, but something about Jack's eyes, familiar but haunted, struck a chord deep within him. As the crowd circled and whispers began to spread, the question on everyone's lips wasn't just why Trump was speaking to a homeless man, but why he had stopped at all. This wasn't a typical Trump move. What was happening here? And why did it feel like the world was about to change? The camera flashes grew brighter, and a simple gesture, a handshake, a few words, was about to make headlines. The viral storm had begun. The moment came swiftly, as moments of fate often do. Trump had only meant to pass by, his thoughts already drifting toward the meetings and commitments of the day. He was headed to the Trump Tower, preparing for a series of back-to-back appointments with key business partners and media teams. But when he saw Jack, something shifted, an undeniable tug at his conscience that was impossible to ignore. It started with a simple glance. Jack was sitting on the cold pavement, his eyes hollow, staring down at a coffee cup that had seen better days. His military jacket, frayed at the edges, seemed to whisper of past glory, now faded into the background of the city's bustle. He didn't look up as people passed by, his back hunched against the wind, his legs wrapped tightly in a blanket that seemed too small to provide any real warmth. Trump, walking briskly toward the entrance of the building, slowed his pace as he passed Jack. A moment of hesitation, a pause in time, caught him. There was something hauntingly familiar about the man. It wasn't just the military jacket. It was the look in his eyes, the tiredness in his posture. Trump had seen it before, in the faces of old friends, in the eyes of those who had sacrificed everything for their country only to return home and be forgotten. The image of a soldier without purpose struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. Without thinking, Trump turned around. The whispers from the crowd grew louder as they noticed his shift in direction, the cameras snapping into place like a wave of curiosity and expectation. A few reporters had already recognized him, but no one could anticipate what was about to unfold. "Hey!" Trump called out, his voice gruff, cutting through the chilly morning air. Jack didn't immediately respond. It took a moment before he raised his head, his eyes clouded with disbelief. Perhaps it was the voice, the familiar tone of a figure known to all. Or maybe it was just the sheer absurdity of the moment that made Jack look up. "Are you okay?" Trump asked, more directly than most would have dared. The question was simple, but the weight of it hung in the air like an accusation. It was clear this wasn't just a casual inquiry. Trump's gaze was steady, piercing even, as if he was seeing through the layers of Jack's hard exterior to something deeper. For a long beat, Jack didn't speak. He simply stared at the man standing above him. There was something vulnerable about the veteran's silence, something that unsettled Trump. It was the first time in a long while that he'd felt like he wasn't in control of the situation. "I'm fine," Jack muttered, his voice rough like the words had been trapped for too long. But Trump wasn't convinced. He had seen enough to know that fine was a mask. Jack was far from fine, and it was written in the tremble of his hands and the deep lines of sorrow etched into his face. As Trump bent down to speak again, a crowd of onlookers began to gather, curious, recording the interaction. Jack's eyes flickered to the people around them, his discomfort palpable. Trump, however, seemed unfazed by the growing attention. His expression softened, perhaps for the first time in years. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jack," the man replied, barely audible, and then, without warning, something inside Trump clicked. It wasn't a grand gesture nor a public relations stunt. It was something deeply personal. This wasn't just about the spectacle of a former president reaching out to a homeless man. It was a man, in the midst of his hectic world, deciding to stop and acknowledge the life of someone who had fallen through society's cracks. The world had been watching him for years, waiting for the next move, the next headline. But today, the cameras were capturing something different. It wasn't about the grandeur of Trump's empire. It was about Jack's lost life, and for the first time in years, the billionaire felt a tug at his soul. Behind him, people whispered and took videos. The reporters started to crowd in, eager to catch whatever moment would break the internet. Trump could feel the pressure of their eyes, but it didn't matter. Not right now. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, only that he had to do something. And that something, in this moment, felt like it had the potential to change more than just Jack's life. Jack, for his part, stared at Trump with a mix of gratitude, confusion, and suspicion. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence between them. Trump paused. He didn't have a clear answer, at least not one that made sense to anyone. "I don't know. Maybe because you shouldn't be here. Not like this. Not forgotten." And with those words, the catalyst had arrived. The crowd stirred. The world watched, and the story of Jack and Trump was about to spread like wildfire. The world wasn't about to let this moment slip into the background. Within hours of the encounter, the story of Donald Trump and Jack Turner had exploded across social media, news outlets, and television screens. The unexpected act of kindness was being dissected by pundits, analyzed by critics, and celebrated by those who longed to see the humanity behind the headlines. But as the dust settled and the cameras turned away, Trump was left standing in the midst of a far more complicated situation than he had ever anticipated. The initial reaction was electric. For once, the usual barrage of criticisms aimed at Trump took a back seat to admiration. Some saw the gesture as a long-overdue reconciliation, an unexpected redemption. Others questioned his motives. Was this a political move, a calculated public relations tactic, or a genuine act of compassion? Whatever it was, Trump knew that people were paying attention, and for the first time in years, that attention didn't come with the usual bitterness or division. But in the days that followed, the challenge became more complicated. Trump had, in a single moment, stepped out of his comfort zone, and now he was faced with the weight of his decision. Jack had become something of a sensation, and the veteran's life was being paraded before the world. Though the media adored the emotional headline, Trump found himself trapped between two forces: the media's expectations and the raw vulnerability of a man whose life he had only just begun to understand. The first obstacle came when Jack refused to leave the streets. Despite the media frenzy and public outcry, Jack was hesitant to accept any help. His pride was too strong, and the weight of years spent surviving alone was a barrier that Trump hadn't anticipated. When Trump offered to help Jack get back on his feet, get him into a shelter, find him a job, give him the resources he needed to rebuild his life, Jack recoiled. "No," Jack said flatly, shaking his head. "I've been helped before. I've been told that everything would be different. Nothing's changed." Trump was stunned. He wasn't used to his offers being rejected, much less by someone who had so little to hold on to. For a brief moment, his confidence wavered. He found himself standing before Jack, unsure of how to proceed. Was this really just an empty gesture? Could he, with all his wealth and power, truly make a difference in a world that had long since ignored men like Jack? For a few days, Trump stepped back. The calls, the emails, the press conferences all seemed to blur together in a whirlwind of voices and expectations. He'd always been a man in control of his own destiny, his businesses, his political career, his public image. But here, with Jack, he felt like an outsider. The public's affection for Jack was growing, and Trump's image had begun to take on an unintended shape. A savior in the eyes of some, but a spectacle in the eyes of others. In the quiet moments, when he wasn't surrounded by advisors or reporters, Trump wrestled with self-doubt. He had faced many battles in his life, but none like this. What if Jack didn't want to be helped? What if this was all just a fleeting moment, a single act in a life full of failures? What if Trump, in his quest to help, had only made things worse? The questions lingered, gnawing at him. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when he'd seen Jack's eyes, those tired, haunted eyes, staring back at him. There was more to this story than media buzz, and if there was one thing Trump understood, it was that the real work, truly changing a life, had only just begun. But what would it take to break through the walls Jack had built around himself? Would he be able to rise to the occasion, or would the forces that had kept Jack on the streets for so long be too powerful to overcome? Trump was about to find out. It was late afternoon when Trump's phone buzzed in his hand, a familiar sound that had once signified another business deal, another victory in the boardroom. But this time, the message was different. The text, short and clipped, was from Jack's estranged sister, Emily, who had been watching the media coverage unfold with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. She had heard the rumors, seen the photos, and now, with a hesitant hand, had reached out to Trump. "Please come meet me," the message read. "Jack won't talk to me anymore, but maybe he'll talk to you. I need you to understand what happened." It was a punch to the gut for Trump. He had assumed, naively, that his gesture had been enough to make Jack feel like he had a second chance. The world had praised the former president's unexpected kindness, but the reality of Jack's situation was far more complex than he could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a man with a past of bad decisions. This was a man whose life had been shaped by forces far beyond his control. Trump agreed to meet Emily at a small cafe in the East Village, a quiet place away from the cameras, where the weight of his public persona wouldn't hang in the air. When he arrived, Emily was already there, sitting at a corner table, her eyes red from crying. There was a deep sadness in her presence, but also a sharpness, an urgency that Trump hadn't expected. "Thank you for coming," Emily said, her voice cracking with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. "I didn't know who else to turn to. Jack, he's not the same person he used to be. What you saw on the streets, that's not who he is deep down." Trump sat down across from her, unsure of what to expect. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly, his tone softer than he intended. He wasn't a stranger to hardship, but this felt different. It wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about the broken system, the fractured relationships, and the unseen scars that run deep in the lives of people who've been forgotten. Emily leaned in, her hands trembling. Jack came back from the war, and he was different. Not in the way people think. It wasn't just the physical injuries. He couldn't sleep. He was haunted by what he'd seen, and he was angry. Angry at the government, angry at the world for sending him off. To fight, only to leave him stranded when he came back. Trump's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but with every new detail, the stakes grew higher. Jack wasn't just a homeless man. He was a casualty of a system that had failed him and countless others. The moment Jack had stepped onto those streets, he hadn't just been abandoned by society. He had been abandoned by the very institutions he had fought to protect. Emily continued, her voice steady now but laced with pain. Jack started drinking to numb the pain, but it only made things worse. He couldn't find a way out. We tried everything, rehab, therapy, shelters, but he kept pushing us away. And eventually, he just disappeared. Trump felt a rush of guilt wash over him. He had been so quick to act, so eager to help, but he hadn't understood the depth of Jack's pain. It was more than a simple rescue. It was a call for someone, anyone, to truly listen and understand. To see past the surface and into the broken pieces of a man who had given everything for his country, only to be left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by trauma. The realization hit Trump with an emotional force that he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about Jack. This was a moment in his own life that forced him to confront his own blind spots. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, around his business, his image, his political career, that he had failed to see the walls that Jack had built around himself too. For the first time in a long while, Trump felt a profound shift inside him. His perspective was changing. This wasn't about optics. This wasn't about making a statement for the cameras. This was about doing something real, something lasting. And as Emily spoke, Trump knew, with a certainty that hit him like a thunderclap, that this journey was far from over. Jack needed more than he had to offer in that moment. It was time to dig deeper, to challenge the system, and maybe, just maybe, change the way the world saw its veterans. But what would that look like? What would he need to do to break through? Jack's walls? To convince him that for once someone was there to help? The air was thick with tension as Trump walked down the familiar path of the streets where he had first met Jack. This time, there were no cameras, no crowd of onlookers. It was just Trump and the man whose life had become an unexpected mirror of his own. Jack was sitting against the same building where Trump had first found him, a cup of stale coffee resting beside him, his military jacket draped over his shoulders, like a shield. But now, there was something different. The expression on Jack's face was not one of defeat, but of quiet resignation, like he was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the world to finally make sense. Or maybe he was just waiting for someone to show up who actually cared. Trump stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment felt surreal, as though the weight of the past few weeks had all built to this single confrontation. He had spent days reflecting on his conversation with Emily, on the stories of Jack's suffering, and on the painful realization that he hadn't truly understood what Jack had endured. "Jack," Trump said, his voice quieter than usual, "I know I've been pushing you, maybe too hard." Jack didn't look up, but Trump could see the slight tightening of his jaw. He wasn't angry. No, Jack was exhausted. Exhausted from trying to survive, from the weight of expectations that had been thrust upon him by a society that had never truly cared. "I'm not here to rescue you, Jack," Trump continued, his tone steady now. "I can't change the past. I can't take away the pain, but I can give you a chance. A real chance." There was a long pause before Jack finally spoke. His voice, raspy and worn, cracked through the silence. "You think you can fix me, don't you?" Trump knelt down, locking eyes with him, I'm not trying to fix you, Jack. I'm trying to show you that you don't have to keep fighting this alone." For the first time since their encounter, Jack's eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the years of hardened armor. Slowly, with great effort, he stood. Trump extended his hand, not as a man offering charity, but as someone who wanted to be a part of Jack's journey. And for the first time, Jack took it. The handshake wasn't just a gesture, it was a moment of mutual understanding, a recognition that both men had battles to fight, and together, they could begin the long road toward healing. In the weeks that followed, the story of Jack Turner and Donald Trump took on a life of its own, but it wasn't the headlines or the media buzz that mattered anymore. It was the quiet moments that told the real story. The moments when Jack, with hesitant steps, began to rebuild his life. With Trump's help, Jack moved into a small apartment, his first real home in years. It wasn't a mansion nor a luxurious condo, but it was a space he could call his own, a place where he could sleep without the cold bite of the streets, a place where he could finally begin to confront his past without the constant reminder of his failures. Trump, on his part, had not just offered Jack a roof over his head, but a second chance, one that didn't come with strings attached or expectations. He didn't ask Jack to be grateful. He didn't demand public acknowledgement or praise. He simply gave him the space to heal at his own pace. The first few days were difficult. Jack had been to countless shelters, rehabs, and programs that promised change, but always left him feeling more isolated, more broken. This time, it felt different. Trump's offer wasn't about charity, it was about recognizing Jack as a man who deserved dignity and a chance to find peace. As the weeks turned into months, the media coverage shifted. Trump's involvement with Jack was no longer a spectacle. Instead, it became a story of quiet perseverance, of two people, unlikely allies, carving out a path forward in a world that often forgot those who needed it the most. Jack eventually started attending therapy, reconnecting with old friends, and even began working part-time at a local veterans organization, helping others who had faced the same demons. The veterans community, which had once been a source of pain for him, now became a place of healing. He found solace in talking with others who had carried the same burdens, and in turn, he began to feel like he wasn't alone anymore. Trump, on the other hand, had experienced a transformation of his own, the experience of truly connecting with someone from a completely different world had changed him. It forced him to confront the realities of the system he had long championed, realities that had left people like Jack on the margins. He didn't have all the answers, but he started asking different questions. What was it worth to build an empire if the foundation was built on inequality and neglect? What did success mean when it didn't extend to those who needed it most? And in his own way, Trump began pushing for change, lending his voice and his resources to initiatives aimed at improving the care and support for veterans. The old walls that had once defined his world began to crack, replaced by a deeper understanding of what it meant to give, not for the sake of optics, but for the sake of the people who deserved more. One evening, months after that fateful encounter, on Fifth Avenue, Trump stood in front of a crowd at a veterans event, his words echoing through the room. "There's a lot of talk about heroes," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they're the ones who need our help the most, and sometimes it's our job to step in and give them the chance to be what they've always been, their best selves." Jack sat in the front row, a small smile on his face, knowing that his journey was far from over, but that for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. As the applause rang out, Trump turned his gaze toward Jack. The two men shared a look, one that didn't need words. It wasn't just a handshake anymore. It was a bond, one forged in the quiet moments that didn't make headlines, but that changed lives, one person at a time. And as Trump left the stage, he realized that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in achieving success, but in recognizing when it was time to step back and allow someone else the chance to rise.